Before we begin, if you're drawn to the documented truth behind America's most controversial espionage cases and the real human cost behind Cold War ideology, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these meticulously researched investigations every week. Now, let's examine how one afternoon of testimony destroyed a diplomat's life and divided a nation. On the afternoon of August 3, 1948, at approximately 2:47 p.m., a 37-year-old magazine editor named Whittaker Chambers sat in room 1400 of the old House Office Building in Washington, D.C., facing members of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The hearing room was packed with journalists, congressional staff, and members of the public who had come to witness what promised to be another in a series of investigations into communist infiltration of the U.S. government. The air conditioning struggled against the August heat, and the windows had been opened to let in whatever breeze might offer relief. Chambers, a heavy-set man with a round face and tired eyes, wore a rumpled brown suit that looked as though it had been slept in. He had been called to testify about his knowledge of Communist Party activities in the United States during the 1930s, a period when he claimed to have been an active member of the underground communist apparatus. What Chambers would say that afternoon would set in motion a chain of events that would consume American politics for the next 2.5 years, destroy the career and reputation of one of the most prominent diplomats in the country, divide the nation along ideological lines, and raise questions about loyalty, truth, and the nature of evidence that would echo through American jurisprudence for decades. His testimony would lead to one of the most controversial espionage cases in American history, a case that would help launch the political career of a young congressman named Richard Nixon and would become a touchstone in debates about communism, internal security, and Cold War paranoia that continue to this day. The man Chambers accused that afternoon was Alger Hiss, a 44-year-old attorney who had served in senior State Department positions, including at the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and the United Nations Organizing Conference in San Francisco in April 1945. By 1948, he had left government service and was serving as president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the most prestigious positions in the world of international relations and diplomacy. Chambers's accusation was straightforward. Alger Hiss had been a member of a secret communist cell within the U.S. government during the 1930s, and Chambers knew this because he himself had been part of that same underground organization. According to Chambers, he and Hiss had been friends and collaborators in the communist cause, meeting regularly between 1934 and 1938 to discuss party business and, eventually, to pass classified documents from the State Department to Soviet intelligence. Alger Hiss had been born in 1904 in Baltimore, Maryland, into a family that had once been prosperous but had fallen on difficult times after his father's suicide in 1907. His mother, Mary, had struggled to raise 5 children on limited means, but she had been determined that her children would receive good educations and regain the family's lost social standing. Alger had been an excellent student, earning a scholarship to Johns Hopkins University, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1926. He had then attended Harvard Law School, where he served on the Harvard Law Review and graduated in 1929. At Harvard, he had studied under Felix Frankfurter, who would later become a Supreme Court justice and who would remain a mentor and friend throughout Hiss's career. After law school, Hiss had clerked for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., one of the most coveted positions available to a young attorney. Holmes, then in his final year on the court at age 90, had taken a liking to the intelligent and diligent young man from Baltimore. In later years, Hiss would often speak of his time with Holmes as formative, describing the justice as embodying the best traditions of American legal thought and progressive idealism. In 1933, as the Roosevelt administration took office and began implementing New Deal programs to address the Great Depression, Hiss had joined the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, one of the new federal agencies created to regulate farm production and stabilize agricultural prices. From there, he had moved to the Justice Department, then to the State Department in 1936. His rise had been steady and impressive. By 1944, at age 40, he was director of the Office of Special Political Affairs, attending major diplomatic conferences and advising Secretary of State Edward Stettinius on critical policy matters. Hiss had married Priscilla Fansler Hobson in 1929. Priscilla came from a well-educated progressive family and shared Hiss's interest in social reform and international affairs. They had one son, Tony, born in 1941. The family lived in a comfortable home in Georgetown, socialized with other Washington professionals and diplomats, and, by all outward appearances, embodied the cultured, public-spirited elite that staffed the upper levels of the federal government. Whittaker Chambers's background could not have been more different from Hiss's privileged trajectory. Born J. Vivian Chambers in 1901 in Philadelphia, he had grown up in a troubled household marked by his father's long absences, his parents' eventual separation, and his younger brother's suicide in 1926, a trauma that would haunt him throughout his life. He had attended Columbia University, but left without graduating, later becoming a freelance writer and translator. In 1925, he joined the Communist Party USA and became deeply involved in party activities, writing for communist publications, and eventually, according to his later testimony, being recruited into the party's underground apparatus responsible for espionage activities. Chambers claimed that from approximately 1932 to 1938, he had worked as a courier and coordinator for a secret communist organization that operated within the federal government. His role, as he described it, was to collect information and documents from government employees who were secret Communist Party members and to pass this material to Soviet intelligence handlers. He claimed to have worked with a network of perhaps a dozen government employees, most of them in the Agriculture Department, the Treasury Department, and the State Department. According to Chambers, these individuals provided him with classified documents, which he would photograph before returning them, or with information about government policies and personnel that would be useful to Soviet intelligence. In 1938, Chambers said, he became disillusioned with communism, particularly after the Moscow show trials and Stalin's purges became widely known. He claimed he broke with the party and went into hiding for several months, fearful that communist agents might try to kill him to prevent him from exposing the underground network. He eventually resurfaced and began working as a writer and editor, first as a freelancer, and then, beginning in 1939, as a senior editor at Time magazine, where he worked on the magazine's foreign news coverage. Chambers said that he had tried several times between 1939 and 1948 to warn government officials about communist infiltration, but that his warnings had been largely ignored or dismissed. In 1939, he claimed, he had met with Assistant Secretary of State Adolf Berle and had provided him with a list of government employees he believed to be secret communists. Berle had taken notes, but apparently had not pursued the matter aggressively. In 1942, and again in 1945, Chambers said he had spoken with FBI agents and had provided them with similar information, though again without apparent result. By 1948, the political climate had changed dramatically. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had given way to Cold War confrontation. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948, the Berlin blockade beginning in June 1948, and mounting evidence of Soviet espionage operations within the United States had created an atmosphere of suspicion and alarm. The House Committee on Un-American Activities, which had existed since 1938, but had been relatively peripheral to American politics, had become increasingly active and influential. Its members saw themselves as defenders of American security against communist subversion, and they conducted high-profile hearings designed to expose communist influence in government, labor unions, Hollywood, and other institutions. It was in this context that Whittaker Chambers was called to testify on August 3, 1948. His testimony that afternoon was measured and detailed. He described his own involvement in the communist underground during the 1930s. He named several government employees he claimed had been part of the secret communist organization, providing details about their activities, their positions, and their relationships with him. Among those he named was Alger Hiss. Chambers testified that he had known Hiss as a dedicated and disciplined communist, and that they had met regularly between 1934 and 1938. He described having visited Hiss's home, having gone on vacation with Hiss and his family, and having received from Hiss classified State Department documents to be photographed and transmitted to Soviet intelligence. Chambers provided specific details about Hiss's apartments and homes during this period, about Hiss's wife Priscilla, about Hiss's interests and habits, and about conversations they had had about communist ideology and party work. When news of Chambers's testimony reached Alger Hiss, who at the time was in New York serving as president of the Carnegie Endowment, his response was immediate and categorical. He denied ever having been a communist, denied ever having engaged in espionage, and stated that he did not know anyone named Whittaker Chambers. Hiss sent a telegram to the committee requesting an opportunity to testify and defend himself against what he characterized as false and malicious accusations. On August 5, 1948, 2 days after Chambers's testimony, Alger Hiss appeared before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He was composed, articulate, and emphatic in his denials. He stated under oath that he was not and had never been a member of the Communist Party, that he had never known anyone named Whittaker Chambers, and that he had certainly never engaged in any kind of espionage or underground communist activity. Hiss's testimony was impressive. He spoke confidently, provided detailed responses to questions, and came across as a credible, distinguished public servant who was the victim of false accusations. Several members of Congress who observed both Chambers and Hiss testify came away believing Hiss and doubting Chambers. Chambers, after all, was admittedly a former communist who had engaged in underground activities. Hiss was a Harvard-educated diplomat who had served his country at the highest levels. The contrast in their backgrounds and their demeanors was stark. However, one member of the committee was not convinced. Representative Richard Nixon, a 35-year-old freshman congressman from California, believed that Chambers's testimony contained too much specific detail to be fabricated. Nixon pressed the committee to continue the investigation rather than dropping it as some members suggested. Over the next several weeks, Nixon led a subcommittee that conducted additional private hearings, questioning both Chambers and Hiss in detail. On August 7, 1948, Chambers testified again before the subcommittee, this time in executive session. He provided extensive details about Alger Hiss's life during the 1930s, the addresses where Hiss had lived, the furniture in his apartments, his wife's interests, his hobbies, the car he drove, the places he vacationed. Chambers described how Hiss had given him an old Ford automobile in 1936 as a gift to the Communist Party. How Hiss was an amateur ornithologist who took particular pleasure in having once spotted a prothonotary warbler, a rare bird, along the Potomac River. Chambers described Priscilla Hiss as a fellow communist sympathizer who had been fully aware of and supportive of her husband's party activities. On August 16, 1948, Hiss was brought back for another private session with the subcommittee. He was shown photographs of Whittaker Chambers, though the photographs were not identified by name. After examining them, Hiss said the man in the photographs looked somewhat familiar and might be someone he had known very briefly in the mid-1930s under a different name. Hiss said he had once rented a room in his apartment to a freelance writer who had identified himself as George Crossley, and that this George Crossley might be the same person as the man in the photographs, though he could not be certain. This partial admission changed the dynamic of the investigation. If Hiss had known Chambers under a different name, then his categorical denial of knowing anyone named Whittaker Chambers was technically true, but fundamentally misleading. Nixon and the committee pressed Hiss for more details about this George Crossley. Hiss said Crossley had rented a room in his apartment for a few weeks in 1935, that he had been a somewhat shabby character who had never paid the rent he owed, and that Hiss had eventually given him an old car to settle the debt. Hiss acknowledged having seen Crossley a few times after that, but insisted the relationship had been brief and inconsequential. On August 17, 1948, Chambers and Hiss were brought together for a dramatic confrontation at the Commodore Hotel in New York City, in a hearing room arranged by the committee. Hiss was given the opportunity to examine Chambers in person and to determine whether Chambers was indeed the man he had known as George Crossley. After looking at Chambers, asking him some questions, and asking him to speak certain phrases, Hiss said that yes, this appeared to be the man he had known as Crossley, though Chambers looked different than he remembered, heavier, with different teeth. Chambers, for his part, calmly reaffirmed his testimony. Yes, he said, he had known Alger Hiss well during the 1930s. They had not been casual acquaintances but close friends and communist collaborators. Hiss had not simply rented him a room. They had stayed in each other's homes, had gone on trips together, had been part of the same underground communist organization. The confrontation did not resolve the fundamental question of who was telling the truth. Hiss insisted that his relationship with the man he knew as Crossley had been brief and insignificant. Chambers insisted that the relationship had been extensive and that Hiss had been an active and committed communist engaged in espionage. One of them was lying. But which one? The committee hearings continued through August and into September 1948. The case became a national sensation, covered extensively in newspapers and on radio. The public divided along largely partisan and ideological lines. Liberals and Democrats tended to believe Hiss and to view the committee's investigation as a partisan witch hunt designed to embarrass the Roosevelt and Truman administrations by suggesting they had employed communist agents. Conservatives and Republicans tended to believe Chambers and to view the case as evidence of dangerous communist infiltration of the government that Democrats had failed to address. In late September 1948, Alger Hiss made a fateful decision. He filed a lawsuit against Whittaker Chambers for defamation, seeking $75,000 in damages. The lawsuit was based on statements Chambers had made on a radio program called Meet the Press on August 27, 1948, in which Chambers had repeated his accusation that Hiss had been a communist. Hiss's lawsuit challenged Chambers to prove his accusations in court or face legal consequences for making false statements. The defamation suit put Chambers in a difficult position. Up to this point, Chambers had testified that Hiss had been a communist and had been involved in underground party activities, but Chambers had not explicitly accused Hiss of espionage. The distinction was significant. Membership in the Communist Party, while politically damaging, was not illegal. Espionage, however, was a crime punishable by severe penalties, including potentially the death penalty. Moreover, the statute of limitations for espionage was 10 years, meaning that activities in the 1930s could no longer be prosecuted. But perjury, lying under oath, had a 5-year statute of limitations and could still be prosecuted if Hiss had lied in his testimony to Congress. To defend himself against the defamation suit, Chambers would need to produce evidence that his accusations were true. In November 1948, during a pretrial deposition for the defamation case, Hiss's attorneys pressed Chambers about whether he had any physical evidence to support his claims that Hiss had been involved in communist activities. Chambers had previously testified that he had no such evidence. But now, facing the prospect of losing the defamation suit and being forced to pay substantial damages, Chambers changed his story. On November 17, 1948, Chambers led Hiss's attorneys to his farm in Westminster, Maryland, a 400-acre property where he had been living since the early 1940s. There, he produced a package he said he had hidden in a dumbwaiter shaft years earlier. The package contained approximately 65 pages of typewritten documents that appeared to be copies or summaries of State Department cables and reports from early 1938. As well as 4 small pages of notes written in what appeared to be Hiss's handwriting, also appearing to summarize State Department documents. The documents were stunning. If authentic, they constituted evidence that someone had been taking classified State Department materials out of the building and copying them, exactly what Chambers had claimed Hiss had been doing. The typewritten documents appeared to have been copied on a Woodstock typewriter, and Chambers claimed that Priscilla Hiss had typed them on the Hiss family's typewriter while Alger brought home the original documents for copying. But Chambers was not finished. On December 2, 1948, responding to a subpoena from the House Committee on Un-American Activities, Chambers produced even more dramatic evidence. He led 2 committee investigators to his farm and directed them to a hollowed-out pumpkin in a field where he grew vegetables. Inside the pumpkin, wrapped in wax paper and protected from the elements, were 5 rolls of developed 35mm film. The film contained photographs of State Department documents from early 1938, similar in nature to the typewritten documents Chambers had produced 2 weeks earlier. The pumpkin papers, as they immediately became known in the press, created a national sensation. The image of espionage documents hidden in a pumpkin on a Maryland farm captured the public imagination and seemed to lend a bizarre but compelling credibility to Chambers's story. Why would someone fabricate such an elaborate tale and hide fake documents in such an odd location? The specificity and strangeness of the story seemed to argue for its truthfulness. Federal prosecutors and FBI agents immediately began analyzing the documents and the film. State Department officials confirmed the documents were genuine classified materials from early 1938, and FBI analysts verified they had been copied or photographed from originals. Some were highly classified, containing information about U.S. diplomatic negotiations, intelligence assessments, and sensitive communications. If these documents had indeed been provided to Soviet intelligence, it would constitute a serious breach of national security. The FBI launched an intensive investigation to determine the documents' chain of custody and whether Alger Hiss could be connected to them. Agents examined the typewritten documents to determine what type of machine had produced them. Typewriters, like fingerprints, have unique characteristics, slight variations in the alignment and shape of letters that can identify a specific machine. FBI document examiners concluded that the typewritten documents had been produced on a Woodstock typewriter, and specifically on a machine that had the same unique characteristics as a typewriter that the Hiss family had owned in the late 1930s. This finding was critical. If the documents had been typed on the Hiss family's typewriter, it meant that someone in the Hiss household had typed them. Chambers's story was that Priscilla Hiss had done the typing, while Alger brought home the original documents. If this could be proven, it would provide powerful evidence of espionage activity. The FBI located the old Woodstock typewriter that the Hiss family had owned. Priscilla Hiss's father had given her the machine as a gift in the early 1930s, and the family had used it for several years before giving it away to a family maid in the late 1930s or early 1940s. The typewriter eventually passed through several hands before the FBI tracked it down in the possession of a junk dealer. Document examiners tested the typewriter and confirmed that its unique characteristics matched those of the machine that had produced the documents Chambers had hidden. On December 6, 1948, 4 days after the pumpkin papers were revealed, Alger Hiss dropped his defamation lawsuit against Whittaker Chambers. The lawsuit had been designed to force Chambers to prove his accusations or admit they were false. Instead, Chambers had produced physical evidence that appeared to support his claims and that put Hiss in serious legal jeopardy. On December 15, 1948, Alger Hiss was called to testify before a federal grand jury in New York that was investigating possible espionage activities. He denied having given any classified documents to Whittaker Chambers or anyone else. He denied that the handwritten notes were in his handwriting, though handwriting experts would later testify that they almost certainly were. The federal prosecutors faced a dilemma. The evidence strongly suggested that espionage had occurred, but the statute of limitations for espionage had expired. The activities in question had taken place in 1937 and 1938, more than 10 years earlier. However, if Hiss had lied under oath in his recent testimony, either to Congress or to the grand jury, that would constitute perjury, and perjury could still be prosecuted. On December 15, 1948, the federal grand jury indicted Alger Hiss on 2 counts of perjury. The first count charged that he had lied when he testified that he had not given classified documents to Whittaker Chambers. The second count charged that he had lied when he testified that he had not seen Chambers after January 1, 1937. The indictment did not charge Hiss with espionage, but the perjury charges were clearly based on the allegation that he had engaged in espionage and had lied to cover it up. Hiss's trial began on May 31, 1949, in Federal District Court in New York. The trial lasted 7 weeks and involved more than 50 witnesses and hundreds of exhibits. The case was prosecuted by Thomas Murphy, an experienced federal prosecutor who had previously won convictions in several high-profile cases. Hiss was defended by Lloyd Paul Stryker, one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in New York, known for his theatrical courtroom style and his ability to sway juries. The trial came down to a contest of credibility between Chambers and Hiss, supported by the physical evidence of the documents and the typewriter. The prosecution's case rested on several key elements. First, Chambers's detailed testimony about his relationship with Hiss during the 1930s. Chambers testified for several days, describing in extensive detail how he and Hiss had met, how their friendship had developed, how they had worked together in the communist underground, and how Hiss had provided him with State Department documents to be photographed and transmitted to Soviet intelligence. Chambers's testimony was remarkably specific, including descriptions of Hiss's apartments, his furniture, his hobbies, his wife's interests, and conversations they had had about communist ideology and party work. Second, the physical evidence of the documents. The prosecution presented the typewritten documents and the microfilm as exhibits, along with expert testimony that the typewritten documents had been produced on the Hiss family's Woodstock typewriter. The prosecution also presented testimony from State Department officials that the documents were genuine State Department materials from 1938, and that many of them had been highly classified. Third, the handwritten notes that appeared to be in Hiss's handwriting. Handwriting experts testified that the notes were almost certainly written by Hiss, and the notes appeared to be summaries of classified State Department documents that Hiss would have had access to in his official capacity. Fourth, corroborating witnesses who testified that they had seen Hiss and Chambers together during the 1930s, despite Hiss's claim that he barely knew Chambers and had not seen him after 1936. The trial became a parade of witnesses whose testimony painted competing portraits of the same man. Haida Massing, a confessed former Soviet agent, testified that she had met Hiss at a dinner party in the mid-1930s, where he had been introduced as someone already working with Soviet intelligence. Under cross-examination, she acknowledged that she had financial difficulties and had been in contact with anti-communist organizations, though she insisted her account was truthful. State Department colleagues testified on Hiss's behalf, describing him as loyal, trustworthy, and dedicated to American interests. Several former Supreme Court law clerks testified to his sterling reputation. Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, in a statement read into the record, vouched for Hiss's character and service. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, Hiss's former professor and mentor, wrote a letter supporting Hiss's character, though he did not testify in person. The defense's case rested primarily on attacking Chambers's credibility and suggesting alternative explanations for the physical evidence. Stryker portrayed Chambers as a pathological liar, a man with a history of mental instability, a former communist who had admitted to deceiving people for years and who could not be trusted to tell the truth. The defense called Dr. Carl Binger, a prominent psychiatrist, who testified that he had observed Chambers throughout the trial and believed he exhibited signs of psychopathic personality, including tendencies toward fabrication and fantasy. Binger's testimony was designed to undermine Chambers's credibility by suggesting he was mentally unstable and unreliable. The prosecution countered with its own psychiatric expert, Dr. Henry Murray, a Harvard psychologist who testified that Chambers showed no signs of mental illness or psychopathic personality, and that his testimony bore the hallmarks of truthful recollection rather than fabrication. Stryker suggested that Chambers might have fabricated the entire story, perhaps stealing documents himself or obtaining them from someone else, and then framing Hiss for reasons that might have included mental illness, jealousy, or a desire for attention and importance. The defense raised questions about the typewriter evidence, suggesting that the FBI might have been mistaken in its identification of the machine, or that Chambers might have had access to the typewriter at some point and might have produced the documents himself to frame Hiss. This theory seemed far-fetched, but the defense argued that given Chambers's admitted history of deception and underground communist activities, nothing could be ruled out. Alger Hiss testified in his own defense, spending several days on the witness stand. He denied all of Chambers's accusations. He acknowledged that he had known someone he believed to be named George Crosley briefly in the mid-1930s, but he insisted that this relationship had been casual and insignificant, a down-on-his-luck writer to whom he had shown some kindness by subletting a room and eventually giving away an old car. He denied having been a communist, denied having given classified documents to anyone, and stated that while the handwritten notes looked similar to his writing, he could not definitively say they were his and had no memory of creating them. Under cross-examination by Murphy, Hiss remained composed but struggled to explain certain details. One exchange captured the tension of the trial. Murphy pressed Hiss about the car. "Mr. Hiss, you testified that you gave this man Crossley, whom you barely knew, a 1929 Ford automobile worth approximately $25. Is that correct?" "That's correct. He owed me money for rent, and I—" "And this was a man you described as shabby, unreliable, someone who didn't pay his debts?" "Yes, he hadn't paid the rent, so I—" "And yet you gave him a car? Not sold it to him, but gave it to him?" "I had already purchased another car and didn't need—" "Mr. Hiss, isn't it true that you gave this car to a Communist Party member as a donation to the party, exactly as Mr. Chambers testified?" "No, that is absolutely false." The exchange illustrated the prosecution's strategy to show that Hiss's explanations for his relationship with Chambers made little sense unless Chambers was telling the truth about their Communist Party connection. Why had he given his car to a casual acquaintance? Why had he allowed Crossley to stay in his home if the relationship was so insignificant? How could Chambers know so many intimate details about his life if they had barely known each other? Hiss's answers, that he had been generous, that Chambers must have learned these details from others, that the whole story was fabricated, seemed less convincing under sustained questioning. Priscilla Hiss also testified, supporting her husband's denials and insisting that she had never typed the documents in question and that she and Alger had never been involved in any communist activities or espionage. Under cross-examination, she appeared defensive and occasionally evasive, particularly when questioned about her own political views during the 1930s and about her relationship with Chambers. Friends who observed her during the trial later said she seemed strained, as though the weight of maintaining the denials was taking a visible toll on her composure and health. On July 8, 1949, after deliberating for nearly 15 hours, the jury announced that it was deadlocked. Judge Samuel Kaufman declared a mistrial. The jury had been split 8-4 in favor of conviction, but could not reach the unanimous verdict required for a guilty finding. Hiss's supporters took some comfort in the mistrial, seeing it as evidence that the case against him was not as strong as prosecutors claimed. However, the government immediately announced that it would retry the case. The second trial began on November 17, 1949, 6 months after the first trial ended. The prosecution was again led by Thomas Murphy, but with additional preparation and refinements to the presentation of evidence. The defense was led by Claude Cross. A different attorney from the first trial, as Stryker had declined to participate in a second trial, reportedly exhausted by the intensity of the first proceeding. The second trial followed much the same pattern as the first, with Chambers providing detailed testimony about his relationship with Hiss and his claim that Hiss had provided classified documents to Soviet intelligence. The physical evidence already described to the grand jury was presented: the typewritten documents, microfilm, and expert testimony about the Woodstock typewriter. The handwriting experts testified again. The corroborating witnesses testified again. Haida Massing had testified briefly in the first trial, but in the second trial she provided more extensive testimony about her alleged encounter with Hiss. She testified that Hiss had spoken knowledgeably about Soviet intelligence operations and had joked with her about which of them was more valuable to the cause. This testimony, if believed, provided damaging evidence that Hiss had not only been a communist, but had been consciously working for Soviet intelligence. The second trial lasted 10 weeks. In the second trial, Hiss repeated his testimony from the first proceeding, denying espionage, minimizing his relationship with Chambers, but the jury proved less sympathetic. Perhaps influenced by the fact that 8 jurors in the first trial had voted to convict. The international situation had also deteriorated further. The Soviet Union had successfully tested an atomic bomb in August 1949, heightening fears about Soviet espionage and the theft of American secrets. On January 21, 1950, after deliberating for 24 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of perjury. The guilty verdict was a devastating blow to Hiss and his supporters. On January 25, 1950, Judge Henry Goddard sentenced Alger Hiss to 5 years in federal prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the law for perjury. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Goddard stated that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the conclusion that Hiss had lied under oath and that he had engaged in espionage activities that threatened national security. The judge noted that he was sentencing Hiss not for espionage, which could not be prosecuted due to the statute of limitations, but for perjury committed in denying that espionage. Hiss's attorneys immediately filed appeals, arguing that the trial had been unfair, that the judge had made errors in admitting evidence and in instructing the jury, and that the verdict was not supported by the evidence. Over the next year, these appeals worked their way through the federal court system. In December 1950, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit upheld the conviction, finding no reversible errors in the trial proceedings. In March 1951, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, letting the conviction stand. On March 22, 1951, Alger Hiss entered the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, to begin serving his 5-year sentence. He was 46 years old, a former senior State Department official who had been at the center of American foreign policy during World War II and its aftermath, now a convicted perjurer imprisoned for lying about espionage. The impact on Hiss's family was profound and immediate. Priscilla Hiss, who had stood by her husband throughout the investigations and trials, now faced social ostracism and financial difficulty. The legal costs of defending against the charges had depleted the family's savings. The defense had cost an estimated $100,000, an enormous sum in 1950. The prestigious Carnegie Endowment had terminated Hiss's employment after his indictment, cutting off the family's primary source of income. Friends and colleagues who had supported Hiss during the trials began to distance themselves, either because they now believed he was guilty or because association with him had become politically and socially toxic in the McCarthy-era atmosphere of the early 1950s. Priscilla found work teaching in private schools, a significant come-down from her previous position as the wife of a prominent diplomat. She struggled financially, selling their Georgetown home and moving to a smaller apartment in New York. Friends later recalled that she aged dramatically during this period, her hair turning gray, her face drawn with stress and worry. Yet she maintained a stoic public demeanor, insisting to anyone who would listen that her husband was innocent and had been railroaded by political enemies. But privately, she sometimes confided to close friends her exhaustion, her confusion about how their lives had come to this, and her fear that they would never escape the shadow of the case. Tony Hiss was 9 years old when his father was convicted and 10 when his father went to prison. According to later accounts, Tony struggled to understand what had happened and why his father had been taken away. His parents' explanations that his father had been wrongly accused, that he was innocent, that someday the truth would be known, and his father would be vindicated, were confusing and incomplete for a child trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly collapsed around him. Life at Louisbourg was a profound shock for a man who had dined with presidents and negotiated with foreign ministers. Hiss was assigned prisoner number 19,137 and sent to work in the prison storehouse, managing inventory of supplies. He later described the work as mind-numbing but preferable to the alternative of idleness. He spent his evenings in the prison library reading extensively history, biography, philosophy, and beginning to plan his eventual appeal efforts. He took correspondence courses, maintaining the intellectual engagement that had defined his life before prison. Other inmates knew who he was. The Hiss case had been front-page news for 2 years, and reactions varied. Some prisoners viewed him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. A famous man brought low. Others saw him as a privileged hypocrite who had betrayed his country while enjoying advantages they had never had. A few suspected he might be an actual communist spy and treated him with hostility. Hiss generally kept to himself, avoiding the prison's social hierarchies and potential conflicts. He was polite but distant, earning a reputation as a model prisoner who followed rules and caused no trouble. He received visitors regularly during his first year. Priscilla came monthly when finances permitted, making the long trip from New York to central Pennsylvania, sometimes bringing Tony. These visits were the highlight of his existence, but also sources of profound pain. He could see the strain on Priscilla's face, the lines deepening around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she spoke about their financial situation. He could see the confusion in Tony's eyes, the way the boy looked at him as though he were a stranger. Conversations were stilted, monitored by guards, conducted in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. What could they talk about? Tony's school, Priscilla's teaching job, the appeal that seemed to go nowhere? They spoke in careful code about topics that mattered: money troubles, Tony's difficulties with other children, the ongoing legal efforts. But underneath every conversation was the unspoken question: how did we get here? And underneath that, are you guilty? By his second year, the visits became less frequent. Priscilla had found full-time work as a teacher to support herself and Tony, and the long trip to Pennsylvania became increasingly difficult to manage financially and emotionally. Tony's visits ceased almost entirely after the first year. Priscilla later explained that the boy found them too disturbing, too painful. He would return from visits silent and withdrawn, sometimes crying in his room late at night when he thought she couldn't hear. For Tony Hiss, the years between his father's conviction in 1950 and his release in 1954 were formative in the worst possible way. He was 10 when his father entered prison, 14 when he was released. These should have been years of little league games, school dances, learning to drive with his father beside him. Instead, they were years of absence, confusion, and social stigma. At school, Tony faced daily reminders of his father's disgrace. Teachers handled him delicately, sometimes with pity that was almost worse than hostility, sometimes with barely concealed suspicion. Was the son of a convicted spy trustworthy? Should they watch what they said around him? Other children were crueler, operating with the casual viciousness that children can inflict on those marked as different. Some avoided him as though guilt were contagious, moving away when he sat down in the cafeteria, not choosing him for teams in gym class. Others taunted him directly. "Your dad's a communist." "Your dad's a traitor." "Is your dad a spy too?" "My dad says your dad should have been shot." Tony learned to lie about his father. When new acquaintances asked where his dad worked, he would say out of town or traveling for business. He learned to change the subject quickly, to deflect questions, to protect the family secret that wasn't secret at all. Everyone knew, or could find out with a few questions to their parents or a trip to the library to look at old newspapers. He became skilled at reading social situations, identifying within minutes of meeting someone whether they knew about his father and, if they did, what they thought about it. He could see it in their eyes, in the slight hesitation before they spoke to him, in the way they glanced at each other when they thought he wasn't looking. At home, Priscilla struggled to explain the unexplainable to a child who desperately wanted to understand. She told Tony that his father had been wrongly accused, that he was innocent, that bad people had lied about him, that someday the truth would be known and his father would be vindicated. But these assurances rang hollow against the reality of prison visiting rooms and newspaper headlines and whispered conversations that stopped when Tony entered a room. If his father was innocent, why was he in prison? If the truth would come out, why hadn't it come out yet? If bad people had lied, why did the courts believe them? Tony developed elaborate fantasies about his father's vindication. He imagined the moment when new evidence would emerge, a confession from Chambers on his deathbed, perhaps, or documents proving a conspiracy, and his father would be released, his name cleared, his reputation restored. They would move back to Georgetown. His father would get his old job back. Everything would return to normal. These fantasies sustained him through the worst moments, but they also made the reality harder to bear. Each month without vindication was another disappointment, another crack in his faith that justice would prevail. The father-son relationship never recovered from these years. When Alger was released in November 1954, having served 44 months of his 5-year sentence, Tony was a teenager who barely knew him. Hiss had been eligible for parole after serving approximately 3 years, but his first application was denied. The parole board cited the seriousness of his offense and his continued refusal to admit guilt or express remorse. In the parole system, maintaining one's innocence was often interpreted as lack of rehabilitation. A year later, his second application was approved, and he walked out of Lewisburg a free man, though free was perhaps not the right word for someone whose reputation was destroyed and whose employment prospects were virtually non-existent. The man who came home was not the father Tony dimly remembered from childhood, but a stranger, older, grayer, thinner, harder. Prison had aged him in ways that went beyond the physical. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and most noticeably, completely consumed by a single obsession, clearing his name. Every conversation circled back to the case. Every decision was filtered through the question of how it might affect his appeals or his public reputation. He collected newspaper clippings, wrote letters to attorneys, drafted motions, and spent hours reviewing transcripts and evidence. They lived in the same cramped apartment but in different worlds, connected by biology and legal obligation, but separated by years of absence and by the unbridgeable gap between Tony's need for a normal father and Alger's need to vindicate himself. Tony wanted someone to attend his school events, to ask about his day, to help him with homework, to be present in his life. Alger was physically there but emotionally absent, his energy directed entirely toward the past rather than the present or future. Tony later wrote that he had spent his entire childhood waiting for his father to come home, and when he finally did, Tony realized that the father he'd been waiting for had never existed. The idealized figure from his early memories, vague recollections of a man who smiled, who played games, who seemed tall and strong and capable, had been replaced by this brittle, obsessed stranger who talked endlessly about typewriters and documents and conspiracies, but never asked Tony how he was doing or what he wanted for his life. Hiss found work as a salesman for a stationery company, then later for a printing firm. The work was respectable, but unremarkable. A profound come-down for a man who had once shaped American foreign policy. He worked under his own name. Attempts to use a pseudonym failed when employers inevitably discovered his identity, and colleagues who learned who he was reacted with varying degrees of discomfort. Some were sympathetic, believing he had been wrongly convicted, or at least that he had served his time and deserved a fresh start. Others were suspicious. Uncomfortable working alongside a convicted perjurer and alleged spy. Most simply wanted to avoid the topic entirely, treating him with careful politeness but keeping their distance. The years between Hiss's release from prison in 1954 and his death in 1996 were a long twilight of diminished circumstances and obsessive attempts at vindication. He never stopped fighting to clear his name, filing motion after motion, pursuing every possible legal avenue, investigating every lead that might provide new evidence. Priscilla stood by him publicly throughout these decades, but friends later reported that their marriage had been hollowed out by the trials and imprisonment and the years of struggle that followed. They maintained a united front for the outside world, attending occasional social functions together, granting rare joint interviews to journalists interested in the case. But privately, they lived increasingly separate lives. Priscilla had her own career as a teacher, her own friends, her own coping mechanisms. She dealt with the trauma by trying to build a normal life despite the circumstances, focusing on her work and her garden and the small pleasures that remained available. Alger had his obsession with clearing his name, which consumed his energy and attention in ways that left little room for ordinary domestic life. He spent evenings and weekends reviewing documents, writing letters, conferring with attorneys. He read every new book about the case, marking up the margins with corrections and objections. He gave occasional lectures to sympathetic audiences, mostly on college campuses, where he would recount his version of events and answer questions from students who had been born after his trial. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Hiss filed numerous legal motions seeking to overturn his conviction or to obtain new trials. He petitioned for access to FBI files under the Freedom of Information Act, hoping to find evidence of government misconduct that might invalidate the conviction. Some documents were eventually released, and Hiss seized on anything that seemed to support his claims, an internal FBI memo questioning some aspect of the evidence, a witness statement that seemed inconsistent with trial testimony. But most of these efforts went nowhere, dismissed by courts that saw no grounds for reopening a case 2 decades old based on minor inconsistencies or procedural questions that had been resolved at trial. In 1975, Hiss published his own account of the case, a book titled In the Court of Public Opinion, in which he argued methodically that he had been framed by a combination of Chambers's lies, FBI misconduct, and Cold War hysteria. The book received respectful but skeptical reviews. Most reviewers acknowledged that Hiss made some valid points about procedural issues and about the political climate that had influenced his prosecution, but found his overall argument, that he was completely innocent and had been the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, unconvincing given the weight of evidence against him. The book sold moderately well, but did not spark the re-evaluation of his case that he had hoped for. In 1978, Hiss filed a lawsuit seeking to have his conviction overturned based on newly released documents that he claimed showed prosecutorial misconduct and FBI improprieties. The lawsuit cited specific FBI memos that Hiss argued demonstrated that prosecutors had known certain evidence was questionable but had presented it anyway, and that FBI agents had pressured witnesses. The lawsuit was unsuccessful. The court found that while some FBI conduct was questionable by modern standards, it did not rise to the level of constitutional violations that would warrant overturning a conviction 3 decades after the fact. The release of the Venona decrypts, beginning in 1995, was perhaps the most crushing blow to Hiss's hopes for vindication. The Venona project had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. American and British intelligence agencies had intercepted thousands of encrypted Soviet intelligence communications during the 1940s and had spent decades attempting to decrypt them. The decryption effort had been enormously difficult, as the Soviets used sophisticated one-time pad encryption systems, but cryptanalysts had managed to partially decrypt several hundred messages by the early 1950s. The decrypted messages revealed extensive Soviet intelligence operations in the United States during the 1930s and 1940s, including networks of agents operating in the federal government, the military, and the private sector. The decrypts confirmed many suspicions about Soviet espionage that had been dismissed as paranoid fantasies during the McCarthy era. It turned out that Soviet intelligence had indeed recruited dozens of Americans, including some in sensitive positions. Several of the decrypted messages appeared to refer to a State Department official with the code name ALS, who had provided classified information to Soviet intelligence and who had attended the Yalta Conference in February 1945. The messages described ALS as having worked with Soviet intelligence since 1935, as having provided valuable information about U.S. diplomatic policies, and as having been congratulated by Soviet intelligence officials for his service. Most historians who examined the Venona evidence in conjunction with the other evidence from the trials, Chambers's detailed testimony, the physical documents, the typewriter, the handwritten notes, concluded that the case against Hiss was overwhelming. The details in the messages matched Hiss's position, his access to classified information, his presence at Yalta, and the time frame of his alleged espionage activities described by Chambers. While the messages did not mention Hiss by name, Soviet intelligence used code names for all agents to protect their identities. The circumstantial fit seemed strong. The debate among mainstream historians shifted from whether Hiss had been guilty to questions about why he had done it, what his motivations had been, and what his case revealed about the political and ideological conflicts of the 1930s and 1940s. Hiss, now in his 90s, disputed the significance of the Venona evidence with the energy of a much younger man. He argued that ALS might refer to someone else, perhaps Wilder Foote, another State Department official who had attended Yalta, or any of several other diplomats who fit some of the description. He argued that code names and cover names were inherently ambiguous and that definitive identification was impossible. He suggested that even if the messages were authentic, they might have been based on Soviet intelligence officers' misunderstandings or exaggerations of their relationships with American contacts. Perhaps a Soviet agent had claimed to be running Hiss, when in fact Hiss had no idea he was being used. These arguments convinced few people outside of Hiss's remaining supporters. The scholarly consensus shifted toward his guilt, though a small number of historians and Hiss family members continued to maintain his innocence. In the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, some former Soviet intelligence officers and historians began publishing accounts based on KGB archives. General Dmitry Volkogonov, a Russian military historian who had been given access to Soviet intelligence archives, initially stated in 1992 that he had found no evidence that Hiss had been a Soviet agent. This statement was seized upon by Hiss and his supporters as vindication. However, Volkogonov later clarified in 1993 that his research had been hasty and incomplete. He had spent only 2 days in the archives and had not conducted a thorough search. He stated that his initial statement should not be taken as definitive proof of Hiss's innocence. Other accounts from former Soviet intelligence officers were less ambiguous. Several former KGB officers, writing in Russian publications in the 1990s, stated matter-of-factly that Hiss had been a Soviet agent, though their accounts varied in detail and reliability. Some of these accounts appeared to be based on genuine knowledge of KGB operations. Others seemed to be based on rumor or appeared commercially motivated by publishers' desire for sensational Cold War revelations. Hiss dismissed all of these post-Soviet accounts as unreliable, arguing that the authors were motivated by commercial interests in telling sensational stories or might be working from incomplete or fabricated archival materials. He maintained until his final days that the Soviet archives, if fully opened, would vindicate him and prove that he had never worked for Soviet intelligence. Alger Hiss died on November 15, 1996, at age 92, still insisting on his innocence. He had lived to see the Cold War end, the Soviet Union collapse, and many of the secrets of that era revealed through Venona and Soviet archives. But he had not lived to see his name cleared, which had been his consuming goal for 46 years. In his final years, he had been largely forgotten by the general public, remembered mainly by Cold War historians and by those who had lived through the controversy of his trials. His death received modest news coverage, most of which focused on the enduring controversy over his guilt or innocence, rather than on his accomplishments or his character. The obituaries were carefully worded, reflecting the unresolved nature of his legacy in the public mind, even as historians had reached conclusions. The New York Times headline read, "Alger Hiss, divisive icon of the Cold War, dies at 92. The Washington Post noted that to the end he maintained his innocence in a case that divided the nation. These cautious formulations captured the ambiguity that still surrounded his case in the eyes of some, even as the weight of evidence pointed clearly to his guilt. He was, the obituaries suggested, either the victim of one of history's great injustices or one of its most persistent liars, depending on which evidence one chose to believe. Priscilla Hiss had died 12 years earlier, in 1984, at age 80, never wavering in her public support for her husband's claims of innocence. According to those who knew her well, she had maintained to the end that Alger had been wrongly convicted, though friends sometimes wondered privately whether she truly believed this, or whether she had simply committed to a position decades earlier and could not abandon it without admitting that she had wasted much of her life defending a lie. She had lived the last decades of her life quietly, maintaining a small circle of loyal friends who believed in Alger's innocence, but largely withdrawn from public life. The strain of the case had taken a permanent toll on her health and her spirit. Tony Hiss became a writer and author, publishing books on urban planning, architecture, and environmental conservation. He carved out a successful career entirely separate from his father's notoriety, though the shadow of the case inevitably followed him. In 1977, he published a book called Laughing Last, which recounted his family's experience during and after his father's trials. The book portrayed his father as innocent and presented the family's perspective on the case: the bewilderment, the sense of injustice, the financial and emotional toll. Tony maintained that his father had been wrongly convicted, though he acknowledged the enduring ambiguity that would likely never be fully resolved. Whittaker Chambers had died much earlier, in 1961 at age 60, of a heart attack at his Maryland farm. He had left Time magazine in 1948 to focus on writing and public speaking about the dangers of communism. In 1952, he published Witness, an 808-page autobiography that detailed his life in the communist underground and his decision to break with the party and testify against former colleagues like Hiss. The book became a bestseller and a foundational text for the conservative movement in America, portraying Chambers as a man who had seen the evil of totalitarian communism firsthand and had courageously chosen to oppose it despite personal cost. Chambers had lived his final years on his Maryland farm, largely withdrawn from public life, suffering from various health problems including heart disease and from episodes of severe depression. In letters to friends during this period, he expressed some regret about the personal consequences of his testimony for people like Hiss and their families, though he maintained that his decision to testify had been necessary and morally correct. He wrote about the loneliness of his position, admired by some, reviled by others, but understood by few. He had betrayed his former comrades to serve what he believed was a higher truth, but betrayal, even in a righteous cause, left scars that never fully healed. The impact of the Hiss case on American politics and culture extended far beyond the immediate question of one man's guilt or innocence. The case helped launch the political career of Richard Nixon, whose role in the House Committee investigation had made him a national figure and had established his reputation as a fierce anti-communist. Nixon parlayed this reputation into a Senate seat in 1950, defeating Representative Helen Gahagan Douglas in a bitter campaign in which he suggested she was soft on communism. He became vice president in 1952, serving under Eisenhower, and eventually won the presidency in 1968. Nixon often referred to the Hiss case as a defining moment in his political development. He wrote in his memoirs that the case had taught him about the determination of the Washington establishment to protect its own, about the power of the press to shape narratives, and about the importance of perseverance in the face of skepticism and opposition. He maintained throughout his life that exposing Hiss had been one of his most important accomplishments, a service to the nation that had revealed the reality of communist infiltration of government. His career ultimately ended in disgrace and resignation after the Watergate scandal, but the Hiss case remained one of his proudest achievements. Beyond Nixon's career, the case transformed American politics. Within months of Hiss's conviction, Senator Joseph McCarthy began making sweeping accusations about communist agents in the State Department, launching the period of anti-communist investigations and blacklisting that became known as McCarthyism. The revelation that a senior State Department official might have been a Soviet spy reinforced fears about communist infiltration of the government and helped create political support for aggressive internal security measures. The Hiss case became a touchstone that both sides invoked in debates about McCarthyism. Conservatives pointed to the Hiss case as proof that concerns about communist infiltration had been legitimate, and that liberals who dismissed such concerns as paranoid had been dangerously naive. Liberals pointed to the case as an example of how legitimate security concerns could be exploited for political purposes and how careers could be destroyed based on the testimony of admittedly unreliable witnesses like Chambers. The case raised profound questions about loyalty, security, and the difficulty of protecting classified information in an open democratic society. How should governments identify and prevent espionage without violating civil liberties? How much surveillance and investigation of government employees is justified in the name of security? What standards of evidence should be required before someone's life and career are destroyed by accusations of disloyalty? These questions, debated intensely in the wake of the Hiss case, remain relevant in contemporary discussions about national security and civil liberties. The case also illuminated the moral complexities of the communist movement during the 1930s and 1940s. Many Americans during the Depression era had been attracted to communism and socialism as alternatives to capitalism, which seemed to be failing catastrophically. The Soviet Union presented itself as a progressive force opposed to fascism and imperialism, and as a society that had supposedly eliminated the exploitation and inequality that plagued capitalist countries. Many young, idealistic intellectuals saw communism as representing the future of humanity and viewed cooperation with Soviet intelligence not as betrayal of their country, but as service to a higher cause that transcended national boundaries. By the late 1940s, after the horrors of Stalin's purges became widely known, after the Hitler-Stalin Pact revealed Soviet cynicism, and after the Soviet Union emerged as America's primary geopolitical adversary, this earlier sympathy for communism seemed naive at best and treasonous at worst. People who had once admired the Soviet Union as a force for progress and social justice now faced accusations of having been disloyal to their country. The gap between how they had understood their actions at the time, as idealistic service to humanity, and how those actions were interpreted in retrospect, as espionage and treason, created enormous personal and moral conflicts. Whittaker Chambers struggled with this gap throughout his life. He had been a true believer in communism during the 1930s, convinced that he was working for human liberation and progress. By the late 1940s, he saw his earlier beliefs as catastrophically misguided, and his earlier actions as having served a totalitarian regime responsible for massive human suffering: the Ukrainian famine, the Great Terror, the Gulag. His testimony against former friends and colleagues was, from his perspective, an act of atonement and an effort to warn his country about dangers he had once failed to recognize. But that testimony destroyed lives and careers, including those of people who might have been motivated by idealism rather than malice. And Chambers carried the weight of that destruction for the rest of his life. Alger Hiss faced a different version of the same dilemma. If he had indeed been a Soviet agent during the 1930s, as the weight of the evidence strongly suggests, then he had to reconcile his earlier idealistic motives with the reality of what he had done. He had betrayed his country's trust, violated his oath of office, provided classified information to a hostile foreign power, and done so repeatedly over a period of years. Whether he saw this as justified service to a higher cause, or whether he later came to regret it, he could never publicly acknowledge it without destroying whatever remained of his reputation and potentially facing additional legal consequences. His decision to deny everything, to maintain his innocence even in the face of overwhelming evidence, to fight for vindication for 46 years, can be understood in multiple ways. Perhaps he genuinely came to believe his own denials, reconstructing his memories over decades to eliminate acknowledgement of what he had done. Human memory is malleable, and it is psychologically possible for people to convince themselves that events they wish had not happened actually did not happen. Perhaps he believed that admitting guilt would betray the ideals he had once held, or would give aid and comfort to anti-communist zealots he despised, or would validate the McCarthy-era persecutions. Perhaps he simply could not face the shame and consequences of confession, the acknowledgement that he had lied to his wife, to his son, to his friends and colleagues, to the nation, and to himself for decades. Or perhaps, as his supporters maintain, and as he insisted to his final day, he really was innocent and his denials were truthful. Perhaps Chambers fabricated the entire story. Perhaps the documents were forged or obtained by Chambers from another source. Perhaps the typewriter identification was mistaken. Perhaps the entire case was a conspiracy to destroy a progressive diplomat whose views were inconvenient to Cold War hawks. This explanation requires believing that multiple witnesses lied, that physical evidence was planted or misidentified, that FBI agents and prosecutors engaged in elaborate misconduct, and that the Venona decrypts either refer to someone else or are themselves unreliable. Most historians find this explanation implausible, but it remains technically possible, and Hiss's defenders have argued versions of it for 75 years. The question of responsibility in the Hiss case is complicated because it requires assigning blame among individuals operating within systems and circumstances that shaped their choices. If Hiss was guilty, as most evidence suggests, he chose to engage in espionage, chose to provide classified documents to Soviet intelligence, and chose to lie about it for 5 decades. Those choices were his, and he bore responsibility for them. He was not coerced, not brainwashed, not acting under duress. He was an intelligent, well-educated man who understood the consequences of his actions and made deliberate choices. But he made those choices in a historical context that made them comprehensible, if not justifiable. The Great Depression had shaken faith in capitalism and democracy. Unemployment reached 25%. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, families lost their homes and savings. The capitalist system seemed to be in its death throes. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite censored reports, appeared to be building a modern industrial society without the chaos of capitalism, without unemployment, without the exploitation of workers by owners. Fascism was rising in Europe, threatening war and genocide. Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. Mussolini had already established a fascist regime in Italy. Franco was waging war against the Spanish Republic. The Western democracies seemed paralyzed, unable or unwilling to confront fascism effectively. The Soviet Union, in contrast, presented itself as the main force opposing fascism, as the vanguard of progress fighting against reactionary forces that threatened civilization. Many intelligent, well-educated, idealistic people saw cooperation with Soviet intelligence not as betrayal of America, but as service to humanity, as contributing to the defeat of fascism and the advancement of social justice. They compartmentalized their actions, telling themselves that the information they provided was not really harmful to American interests, or that helping the Soviets understand American policies would reduce the risk of misunderstanding and conflict, or that their true loyalty was to humanity and progress rather than to national boundaries. These rationalizations were wrong, as history would demonstrate. The Soviet Union was not the progressive force its propaganda claimed, but a brutal totalitarian regime that murdered millions of its own citizens and enslaved Eastern Europe. The information provided by American agents helped the Soviets develop atomic weapons and military technologies that would threaten American security for decades. The American agents' belief that they were serving a higher cause did not justify their betrayal of trust or make the consequences of their actions less severe. But understanding these rationalizations helps explain how someone like Alger Hiss, if he was guilty, could have made the choices he made. He did not see himself as a traitor, but as an idealist working for peace and progress. He did not see himself as betraying America, but as serving a higher vision of what America could become. These self-justifications were ultimately empty, but they felt real and compelling at the time. Whittaker Chambers, who recruited and handled agents for Soviet intelligence during the same period, faced similar choices and made similar rationalizations. He later described the psychological process by which intelligent people convinced themselves that espionage was moral, the gradual escalation of commitment, the emotional investment in the cause, the social bonds with other underground members, the sense of being part of a historic mission. His later decision to break with the Communist Party and testify against former colleagues was courageous in some respects. He risked his career, his reputation, his safety, and his peace of mind to warn about dangers he had come to recognize. But his testimony also destroyed other people's lives based on his interpretations of events from a decade earlier and based on his own credibility as a witness, despite his admitted history of deception and underground activities. Some of the people he accused might have been relatively minor participants in communist study groups rather than active spies. Some might have moved on from their earlier political associations and posed no current threat. Chambers's decision to testify was, from one angle, an act of conscience and patriotism. From another angle, it was an act of betrayal toward people who had once trusted him. The prosecutors and FBI agents who investigated and prosecuted Hiss were doing their jobs, enforcing laws designed to protect national security. But they operated within a political and ideological context that created enormous pressure to find and punish communist agents, a context that may have influenced how evidence was interpreted and how aggressively prosecution was pursued. Some FBI investigative techniques used in the Hiss case would be considered questionable or impermissible by modern standards. Some witness statements were obtained under circumstances that raise questions about their reliability. These concerns do not prove Hiss's innocence, but they complicate simple narratives about justice being served. The real victims, the people who bore consequences they did not deserve, were primarily Hiss's family members, particularly his son Tony. Tony Hiss was a child who loved his father, who had no knowledge of or involvement in any espionage activities, who was traumatized by his father's arrest and conviction, and who grew up in the shadow of his father's disgrace. The damage to Tony's childhood, his education, his social development, his relationship with his father, his sense of security and trust in the world, was real and lasting, regardless of whether Alger Hiss was actually guilty. The burden Tony carried was particularly cruel because it was impossible for him to resolve. If his father was guilty, then Tony had been lied to his entire life by the person he should have been able to trust most. If his father was innocent, then Tony had witnessed a terrible injustice and had suffered for it without any way to make it right. Either way, his childhood and his relationship with his father had been destroyed by forces beyond his control. Similarly, Priscilla Hiss, if she truly had no knowledge of her husband's alleged espionage activities, as she always claimed, suffered enormously for something she had not done and did not know about. She lost her social position, her financial security, her husband to prison for years, and decades of her life to the struggle to clear his name. If she did have knowledge of Alger's activities, as some evidence suggests, then she made her own choices and bore her own responsibility, but she still paid a heavy price that extended far beyond any culpability she might have had. The Hiss case left no clear winners. Alger Hiss, whether guilty or innocent, destroyed his life and his family. If guilty, it was for an ideological cause that by any reasonable measure led not to human liberation, but to totalitarian oppression. If innocent, he suffered one of history's great injustices and spent nearly 50 years trying futilely to prove it. Either way, he lost everything: his career, his reputation, his freedom, his family relationships, his peace of mind. Whittaker Chambers saved his soul, perhaps, by testifying truthfully about his past and warning his country about dangers he had helped create. But he lived his final years in depression and poor health, haunted by the knowledge that his testimony had destroyed other people's lives and isolated from both the communist world he had rejected and the respectable world that viewed him with suspicion. He found some vindication in the conservative movement that embraced his book and his story, but he remained a troubled man who never fully escaped the shadows of his past. Richard Nixon built a political career on the case, but his career ultimately ended in disgrace and resignation after the Watergate scandal revealed his own dishonesty and abuses of power. The same traits that had made him effective in pursuing Hiss, suspicion, determination, willingness to use any available means, eventually led to his downfall. The Hiss case remained one of his proudest accomplishments, but it also exemplified an approach to politics that valued winning over truth and loyalty over law. The federal government successfully prosecuted a perjury case, but could not prosecute the underlying espionage charges due to statutes of limitations and could never definitively prove beyond all possible doubt that Hiss had been a spy. The conviction stood, but it rested on perjury about alleged espionage rather than on espionage itself, leaving a gap between what the evidence suggested had happened and what could be legally proven. The documents hidden in the pumpkin and the dumbwaiter, like the surveillance photographs in other Cold War espionage cases, captured moments and provided evidence. The typewritten pages with their unique typewriter characteristics, the microfilm with its photographed State Department cables, the handwritten notes that appeared to be in Hiss's hand, these were physical objects that could be analyzed. Unauthenticated, admitted as evidence, argued over by attorneys and experts, they provided the foundation for the prosecution's case and have convinced most historians of Hiss's guilt. But documents, like photographs, can only capture surfaces. They are evidence, pieces of a puzzle, artifacts of historical moments, but they cannot capture motivations, moral complexity, or the human cost that rippled outward for decades. They were evidence in a legal case, weapons in a political battle, artifacts that have been analyzed and debated for 75 years, but they were not and could not be the full story of what happened or why it mattered. Espionage is ultimately about human choices made in specific historical moments, about individuals deciding whether to betray trust in service to an ideology or a foreign power, about the gap between how actions are understood at the time and how they are judged in retrospect, about consequences that extend far beyond what anyone anticipated or intended. The hidden files that triggered the Hiss case existed in a dumbwaiter shaft and a hollowed pumpkin for nearly a decade before Chambers produced them under legal pressure. During those years, Hiss rose to greater prominence, attended Yalta, helped organize the United Nations, became president of the Carnegie Endowment. During those years, Chambers worked at Time magazine, built a reputation as a writer and editor, tried to put his underground past behind him. The documents sat hidden, inert, waiting for the moment when they would emerge and destroy lives. When they finally emerged, they set in motion a legal and political process that consumed 2 trials, numerous appeals, decades of controversy, and lifetimes of consequences. They provided evidence that most people found convincing, but that some people disputed. They answered some questions, but raised others. They proved, or seemed to prove, that espionage had occurred, but they could not prove motivations or moral judgments or what lessons should be drawn. The typewritten pages, the microfilm, and the Woodstock typewriter are now preserved in the National Archives, available to researchers drawing their own conclusions. These physical objects remain, tangible proof that something happened, though exactly what happened and what it meant remain subjects of debate. What cannot be preserved or examined in an archive are the human experiences, Tony Hiss's childhood trauma, Priscilla's decades of strain and struggle, Alger's prison years and his obsessive quest for vindication, Chambers's depression and his burden of having destroyed former friends. These lived experiences, these human costs, are recorded only in fragmentary ways in letters and memoirs and oral histories, and they can never be fully recovered or understood by those who did not live through them. The Hiss case stands as a monument to the complexities and tragedies of the Cold War era, a case where questions of innocence and guilt became entangled with questions of ideology and politics, where evidence pointed in one direction, but doubt remained for some, where legal resolution did not provide moral clarity, and where the human cost was borne by people who had little or no choice in the matter. It was a case about documents and typewriters and testimony, but it was ultimately a case about people making choices in difficult circumstances and living with the consequences of those choices for the rest of their lives. Alger Hiss was 44 years old when Whittaker Chambers first publicly accused him of having been a communist. He was 46 when he was convicted of perjury. He was 50 when he was released from prison. He was 92 when he died, still insisting on his innocence. Between the accusation and the death, he lost his career, his reputation, his freedom, his financial security, and his relationship with much of his family. Whether guilty or innocent, whether Chambers told truth or lies, whether the documents proved espionage or something less, the cost was real and permanent.